You think you know micromanaging bosses until your new manager demands that you follow every company policy, procedure, and regulation exactly as written with zero exceptions or independent judgment, then threatens to fire you when you question his unreasonable demands. But what he didn't know is that strict compliance with every single rule would bring the entire department to a grinding halt, expose his complete incompetence, and result in him being demoted to a position beneath the people he used to manage. Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and I need to tell you about the most satisfying malicious compliance I've ever executed against a micromanaging boss who demanded perfection but couldn't handle the consequences of getting exactly what he asked for. This story takes place at Apex Technologies, a mid-sized software company where I have been working as a senior systems analyst for 6 years. I loved my job, had a great team, and worked under a manager who trusted us to use our professional judgment to get work done efficiently. But everything changed when our department got a new director, Trevor Matthews, who decided to restructure our team and bring in his own management. Trevor was 45, had an MBA from a prestigious school, and loved reminding everyone that he had transformed several departments at previous companies. He spoke constantly about operational excellence, process optimization, and accountability metrics. Within his first month, Trevor fired our well-liked manager and replaced him with his former colleague, Richard Brennan, who would turn out to be the most insufferable micromanager I had ever encountered. Richard was 38, had worked with Trevor at 2 previous companies, and seemed to view management as an opportunity to control every aspect of his employees' work lives. He was the kind of manager who believed that employees were inherently lazy and needed constant oversight to produce anything of value. From day one, Richard made it clear that things were going to change dramatically under his leadership. I've reviewed the work practices in this department, and I'm frankly shocked by the lack of structure and accountability. Richard announced at our first team meeting, going forward, we'll be implementing strict adherence to all company policies, procedures, and protocols. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no independent decision-making without explicit approval. What Richard didn't realize was that most successful departments operate with a degree of flexibility and professional judgment that allows experienced employees to navigate the inevitable complexity of real-world work situations. By demanding strict literal compliance with every rule, Richard was about to create a bureaucratic nightmare that would destroy not only his own career, but also Trevor's reputation as a competent executive. The micromanagement begins. Richard's micromanagement started immediately and intensely. Every email we sent had to be approved by Richard before being sent to anyone outside the department. Every phone call with other departments had to be documented in detailed call reports. Every decision, no matter how minor, required Richard's explicit written approval. He implemented a system where we had to submit daily reports accounting for every 15-minute increment of our workday. If you spent 15 minutes in the bathroom, you had to document it. If you spent 10 minutes getting coffee, you had to explain why it took that long. I need to understand exactly how you're spending company time, Richard explained. This level of accountability ensures that we're maximizing productivity and eliminating wasted effort. But Richard's demands went far beyond reasonable management oversight. He wanted us to follow every company policy exactly as written, even when those policies were outdated, contradictory, or created for situations that didn't apply to our work. For example, we had a company policy stating that all software installations required approval from the IT security team, a written justification of business need, and a 2-week waiting period for security review. This policy had been created years ago for installing third-party software on company servers. Richard insisted that this policy applied to everything, including standard developer tools that we used every day. I don't care if you've been using that compiler for 6 years, Richard told me when I asked to update my development environment. Submit the formal request, provide written justification, and wait for IT security approval. Policy is policy. The documentation nightmare. Within 2 weeks of Richard's arrival, our department's productivity had dropped by 60% because we were spending all our time documenting our work instead of actually doing work. Every project now required a formal project initiation document, 12 pages minimum, a detailed work breakdown structure approved by Richard, daily status reports submitted to Richard by end of day, weekly summary reports reviewing the daily reports, monthly project reviews with Trevor and Richard, formal change request documentation for any deviation from the plan. For context, I had previously been working on projects that I could complete in 2 to 3 weeks with minimal documentation. Under Richard's system, the documentation alone took longer than the actual technical work. But when I tried to explain that this level of bureaucracy was making us less productive, Richard's response was dismissive. Daniel, this is called professional project management. If you find documentation burdensome, maybe you're not cut out for senior level work. At my previous companies, this was standard practice for all technical projects. Richard, at your previous companies, did projects actually get completed? Because at this rate, we're going to miss every deadline we have. Projects get completed when they're properly planned and documented. Shortcuts in cowboy coding are what cause problems. We're going to do things the right way from now on. The breaking point. The situation reached a breaking point when Richard threatened to fire me for insubordination because I had made a minor technical decision without his explicit approval. I had updated a database query to improve performance, a routine task that I had done hundreds of times over 6 years. The update took 15 minutes and improved system response time by 40%. Richard called me into his office the next day. Daniel, I received a report that you modified production database code yesterday without submitting a formal change request and receiving my approval. I optimized a query that was causing performance issues. It's a routine maintenance task. I don't care if it's routine. We have policies about production changes. You violated those policies by making unauthorized changes. Richard, if I had to submit a formal change request for every query optimization, it would take weeks to get approval for tasks that take minutes to complete. Then you should plan ahead and submit requests in advance. I'm writing you up for policy violation, and if it happens again, you'll be terminated. You're threatening to fire me for doing my job efficiently? I'm holding you accountable for following company policies. This is your only warning. That conversation was the moment I decided that if Richard wanted strict policy compliance, I would give him exactly that, with devastating consequences. That evening, I went home and did something I had never done in 6 years at the company. I read every single policy, procedure, and regulation that applied to our department. The company policy manual was 347 pages long and covered everything from expense reports to emergency evacuation procedures. Most of it was written by lawyers and HR professionals who had never worked in a technical department and didn't understand how software development actually works. Many of the policies contradicted each other or were written for situations that no longer existed. Some policies referred to systems and processes that had been retired years ago. Others were so vaguely written that strict interpretation would make normal work impossible. But if Richard wanted us to follow every policy exactly as written, I was going to do exactly that. My plan was simple. Comply with every single policy, procedure, and regulation literally and completely, document everything, and let the resulting chaos speak for itself. I would do exactly what Richard demanded, without any shortcuts, workarounds, or professional judgment. Every rule will be followed to the letter, regardless of how absurd or impractical the result. The compliance campaign begins. The next morning, I arrived at work at exactly 8 a.m., our official start time according to policy, and immediately began documenting the fact that I had arrived at 8 a.m., as required by the time reporting policy. The time reporting policy required employees to submit detailed timesheets accounting for all work time, including the time spent completing timesheets. So I spent 15 minutes documenting my arrival and the 15 minutes I was spending on documentation. Then I reviewed the daily task list that I was required to submit to Richard by 8:30 a.m. per his new policy. But creating the task list required me to review my current projects, which required accessing our project management system. According to the IT security policy that Richard had insisted we follow, accessing the project management system required two-factor authentication and a notation in security log explaining the business justification for each login. So I spent 10 minutes logging into the system and documenting my business justification, reviewing project status to prepare daily task list as required by manager. By 9 a.m., I had completed my arrival documentation, logged into necessary systems following all security protocols, and prepared my daily task list. I had accomplished zero actual work. I submitted my task list to Richard at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, as required by policy for all management-requested deliverables. At 9:15 a.m., Richard called me. "Daniel, why does your task list show that you spend the first hour of the day on administrative compliance tasks?" Because I was complying with all relevant policies, time reporting policy, security protocols, and your requirement for daily task lists. That shouldn't take an hour. It does when you follow every step exactly as written in the policy documents. Would you like me to send you the specific policy references? No, just be more efficient about it. Richard, you told him to follow all policies exactly. I'm doing exactly that. If you'd like me to use shortcuts or professional judgment to be more efficient, I can do that, but you specifically said no shortcuts. Richard was silent for a moment. Just get to your actual work. Absolutely. I'll document this conversation in my communication log, as required by policy. The project approval nightmare. Later that morning, I began working on what should have been a simple project, updating our customer database to add a new reporting field. In the past, this would have taken about 3 hours. 30 minutes to understand the requirement. 90 minutes to modify the database schema and update queries. 60 minutes to test and deploy. But under Richard's strict policy compliance regime, I had to follow the formal project process. Step 1. Project initiation document required by PM Policy 3.2. 12-page document describing project scope, objectives, and deliverables. Risk assessment and mitigation strategies, resource allocation and timeline, budget justification, approval signatures from manager and department director. This document took me 6 hours to complete according to the template provided in the policy manual. Step 2. Technical design document, required by Development Policy 5.1. Detailed technical specifications, database schema changes with justification, code design patterns and architecture decisions, security impact analysis, performance impact assessment, another 8 hours of documentation. Step 3. Security review request, required by IT Security Policy 2.7. Formal request to security team for design review. 2-week waiting period for security assessment. Response to any security concerns raised. Updated design based on security feedback. Minimum 2 weeks of waiting time, plus additional hours to address feedback. Step 4. Change Advisory Board approval, required by Change Management Policy 4.3. Formal presentation to Change Advisory Board. CAB meets once per month. Must submit materials 2 weeks in advance of meeting. Must attend meeting to answer questions. Another month of waiting time, plus 6 hours to prepare presentation materials. I had now spent 20-plus hours documenting a project that should have taken 3 hours to complete, and I hadn't written a single line of code yet. I submitted all this documentation to Richard with a note. Per your instruction to follow all policies exactly, I completed the required documentation for the customer database update project. Estimated time to completion, 8 to 10 weeks due to mandatory approval waiting periods. Within 2 weeks of my malicious compliance campaign, our entire department's productivity had essentially dropped to zero. Every member of my team had caught on to what I was doing and began following the exact same approach. Literal, complete compliance with every single policy, regardless of how impractical or absurd the result. Our department had 12 people working on approximately 30 active projects. Under Richard's strict policy compliance regime, here's what was happening. Projects that previously took 2 to 3 weeks now took 3 to 4 months due to mandatory approval waiting periods. We spent 70% of our time on documentation and 30% on actual work. Simple tasks required layers of approval that created massive bottlenecks. Our project backlog grew from 30 projects to 120 projects as new requests came in faster than we could complete old ones. But the most beautiful part of the malicious compliance was that we were following every rule exactly as written. Richard couldn't accuse us of being lazy or unproductive. We were simply doing exactly what he had demanded. When Richard complained about our declining productivity, I had documentation showing that every delay was caused by compliance with official company policies that he had insisted we follow. Richard, I understand you're frustrated with project timelines, but Policy 3.2 requires a formal project initiation document for all technical projects. Policy 5.1 requires detailed technical design documentation. Policy 2.7 requires security review. I'm simply following the policies you told us to follow. Daniel, you're being deliberately obtuse. Obviously, we need some flexibility in how we apply these policies. Richard, you told me I would be fired if I made any decisions without following exact policy. You said, and I quote, "Policy is policy." Should I now use my professional judgment to determine which policies to follow and which to ignore? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Because I have your written directive stating that all policies must be followed exactly as written with no exceptions. Richard had no good answer because I was doing exactly what he had demanded, and the results were exposing how unreasonable his management approach had been all along. The executive attention. By week 4 of the malicious compliance campaign, our department's productivity crisis had attracted attention from senior leadership. Trevor, the director who had brought Richard in, called a meeting with Richard and me to discuss why our project completion rate had dropped 85%. Richard, what's going on with your team? We've gone from completing 8 to 10 projects per month to completing maybe 1 project per month. Explain this productivity collapse. Trevor, my team has been experiencing some adjustment challenges as we implement proper project management and policy compliance. Adjustment challenges? Daniel, you're the senior analyst. What's your perspective on this situation? This was my moment to either expose Richard's incompetence or protect him out of misguided loyalty. I chose exposure. Trevor, Richard has implemented a management approach requiring strict, literal compliance with every company policy, procedure, and regulation. No exceptions, no professional judgment, no flexibility. I'm following his directives exactly. I pulled out a thick folder of documentation. For example, this customer database update project should have taken 3 hours. Under Richard's policy compliance regime, it required 20 hours of documentation and has been waiting 6 weeks for various approvals. It still hasn't been completed. I showed Trevor the project initiation document, technical design document, security review requests, and change advisory board submission materials. Every delay is caused by following policies exactly as written. I have similar documentation for every project in our backlog. Trevor looked at the documentation in disbelief. Richard, you're requiring formal project initiation documents for routine maintenance tasks? I'm requiring proper documentation and approval for all technical work. That's basic professional project management. Richard, these policies were designed for major infrastructure projects, not for database query optimizations. Don't you understand context and professional judgment? Trevor, you brought me in to bring structure and accountability to this department. That's what I'm doing. You're not bringing structure. You're creating bureaucratic paralysis. Daniel, how were these projects handled before Richard arrived? Senior analysts use our professional judgment to determine the appropriate level of documentation based on project complexity, risk, and impact. Routine tasks required minimal documentation. Complex projects required thorough planning. It was efficient and effective. And under that system, how many projects did you complete per month? Our team averaged 8 to 10 project completions per month with high quality and minimal rework. Trevor looked at Richard with visible anger. So you improve a team that was completing 10 projects per month into a team that completes 1 project per month? That's your definition of operational excellence. Trevor, these people need structure and oversight. Left to their own devices, they take shortcuts and create technical debt. Daniel, do you take shortcuts and create technical debt? No, sir. I have 6 years of performance, reviews documenting high-quality work. I've never had a project require major rework or cause production problems. Trevor made a decision right there in the meeting. Richard, effective immediately, you're going to revise your management approach. Stop requiring formal project documentation for routine tasks. Trust your senior people to use professional judgment. Get this department back to productive operation. Trevor, I don't think that's wise. We need accountability. We need results, Richard. Accountability without productivity is worthless. Make the changes. The continued malicious compliance. After meeting with Trevor, Richard called me into his office. Daniel, I hope you're proud of yourself. You deliberately sabotaged my management approach by following policies in the most literal and impractical way possible. Richard, I did exactly what you told me to do. You said to follow all policies exactly with no exceptions. I followed your directive. You knew what I meant. You were being deliberately difficult. Richard, you threatened to fire me for using professional judgment. I took you at your word and followed policies exactly as written. If that created problems, perhaps the problem is with your directive, not with my compliance. This isn't over, Daniel. I'm watching you very closely, and I will find grounds to terminate you. I look forward to continuing to follow your directives exactly, Richard. Despite Trevor's instruction to revise his management approach, Richard doubled down on his micromanagement tactics. He couldn't admit that his approach was fundamentally flawed, so he convinced himself that the problem was insubordinate employees rather than unreasonable policies. Over the next month, Richard became even more controlling and punitive. He instituted mandatory daily stand-ups where each team member had to account for every task completed the previous day. He required approval for bathroom breaks longer than 5 minutes. He monitored our email and questioned why we were communicating with certain people. One of my most satisfying malicious compliance victories involved Richard's expense reports. Richard traveled frequently to meet with other departments and Trevor's executive peers. He submitted expense reports every month claiming thousands of dollars for hotels, meals, and other travel expenses. But our company had very detailed expense reporting policies that almost nobody followed exactly because they were absurdly bureaucratic. For example, Policy 8.2 stated that all meal expenses over $25 required an itemized receipt showing exactly what was ordered, the names of all attendees, and a written justification of the business purpose of the meal. Policy 8.5 stated that hotel expenses required pre-approval from your manager's manager, in Richard's case Trevor, if the nightly rate exceeded the company's negotiated corporate rates. Policy 8.7 stated that any personal expenses included in business travel required a detailed explanation and justification of why combining personal and business travel served company interests. I noticed that Richard's expense reports routinely violated all of these policies. He submitted meal receipts without itemization. He stayed at expensive hotels without pre-approval. He extended business trips to include weekends without explaining whether the extra nights were business or personal. In the past, I would have overlooked these minor policy violations because everyone understood that the expense policies were overly rigid and that reasonable business travelers used their judgment about appropriate expenses. But Richard had established a standard of zero tolerance for policy violations, so I decided that standard should apply to him as well. I sent an email to Richard and CC'd Trevor. Richard, I'm reviewing department expense reports as part of the budget reconciliation process. I noticed several policy compliance issues with your recent travel expenses that need to be addressed. Your October trip to New York includes 3 meal expenses over $25 without itemized receipts. Policy 8.2 violation. Your hotel rate of $325 per night exceeds our corporate rate of $200 per night without pre-approval documentation. Policy 8.5 violation. Your trip extended through the weekend without explanation of whether Saturday/Sunday nights were business or personal expenses. Policy 8.7 violation. Please provide corrected documentation showing compliance with all relevant policies. As you stated repeatedly, policy is policy, and we must maintain accountability. The executive investigation. My email about Richard's expense policy violations triggered an executive investigation that revealed far more serious problems. Trevor assigned someone from internal audit to review Richard's expense reports over the past year. What they found was disturbing. Richard had been staying at luxury hotels and expensing rates 40 to 60% higher than company policy allowed. He had been expensing elaborate meals at expensive restaurants, often without clear business justification. He had been combining business travel with personal vacations and expensing hotel nights that appeared to be personal. He had been expensing first-class airfare upgrades without proper approval. Over 1 year, Richard had claimed approximately $45,000 in questionable travel expenses. But the investigation revealed something even more problematic. Richard had been submitting duplicate expense claims. He had been using both his corporate credit card and submitting expense reports for the same business trips, effectively getting reimbursed twice for many expenses. This wasn't policy violation. This was fraud. The internal audit report concluded that Richard had defrauded the company of approximately $18,000 through duplicate expense claims over 14 months. The fraud consequences. When the expense fraud investigation results came back, Trevor had no choice but to take immediate action. Richard was suspended pending a full investigation. A forensic accountant was brought in to review every expense claim Richard had submitted since joining the company. The final investigation revealed that Richard had submitted duplicate expense claims totaling $18,000, violated expense policies on 47 separate occasions, used company credit cards for personal expenses without proper documentation, claimed business meals that appeared to be personal dining with friends and family. Richard was terminated for cause, meaning he received no severance pay, and his departure was reported to professional organizations as termination for ethical violations. But the consequences extended beyond Richard. Trevor, who had brought Richard in and defended his management approach, came under scrutiny from senior leadership. How had Trevor not noticed that his direct report was committing expense fraud? Why had Trevor supported Richard's destructive management practices, even when they were obviously damaging department productivity? Trevor was quietly demoted from director to manager and moved to a less critical department, the department recovery. With Richard gone, our department needed new leadership. Trevor's replacement as director asked the team who should be promoted to manager. The team unanimously recommended me, despite my role in Richard's downfall, or perhaps because of it. Daniel exposed problems that needed to be exposed, my colleague Sarah said. He did it by following Richard's own rules exactly as demanded. That's not insubordination. That's showing what happens when unreasonable policies are applied without judgment. I was promoted to manager with a $25,000 salary increase and authority to restructure how our team operated. My first act as manager was to implement a policy that explicitly stated, team members are expected to use professional judgment in applying company policies to real-world situations. Strict literal compliance is not required or desired when it impedes productive work. My second act was to eliminate most of Richard's bureaucratic documentation requirements and return to the efficient work practices that had served us well before Richard arrived. Within 2 months, our project completion rate returned to 8 to 10 projects per month. Team morale improved dramatically, and our department became a model for effective technical management. Looking back on this experience, I learned several important lessons about malicious compliance. 1. Sometimes the best way to prove a policy is unreasonable is to follow it exactly. Richard's demands for strict policy compliance seemed reasonable and abstract, but when actually implemented, they created absurd bureaucracy that made productive work impossible. By following Richard's directives exactly as stated, I demonstrated how unreasonable his management approach was. 2. Document everything when dealing with unreasonable managers. I kept detailed records of Richard's directives, my compliance efforts, and the resulting delays. This documentation protected me from claims of insubordination and proved that I was following instructions exactly. 3. Malicious compliance works best when you genuinely follow the rules. The key to effective malicious compliance is that you're not actually doing anything wrong. You're following rules and directives exactly as stated. When the results are absurd, the fault lies with the rules or the person who demanded strict compliance, not with you. 4. Sometimes exposing dysfunction serves everyone's interests. By exposing Richard's destructive management through malicious compliance, I protected not just myself, but my entire team and the company's interests. 5. Bad managers often reveal themselves when forced to live by their own standards. Richard demanded absolute policy compliance from his team, but violated policies himself when it was inconvenient. Apply his own standards to his behavior, expose his hypocrisy and fraud. The current situation. 3 years later, I'm still managing the same department with excellent results. Our team consistently delivers high-quality projects on reasonable timelines while maintaining high morale. Richard never worked in technology again. His termination for fraud made him unemployable in any position requiring trust or financial responsibility. Last I heard, he was working in retail management. Trevor eventually left the company after his demotion. His reputation as an executive who brought in incompetent managers and failed to provide proper oversight made it difficult for him to advance to senior leadership. Several other departments at our company adopted my approach to policy interpretation. Trust experienced professionals to use judgment in applying rules to real-world situations. The company even revised some of its most bureaucratic policies based on the documentation I had created during my malicious compliance campaign. Turns out that forcing someone to follow absurd policies exactly create a perfect record of why those policies need to be changed. Final thoughts. People sometimes ask me if I feel bad about destroying Richard's career through malicious compliance. The answer is that Richard destroyed his own career through incompetent management and expense fraud. I simply documented the consequences of his own demands and policies. Richard insisted on strict policy compliance with no exceptions or professional judgment. I gave him exactly what he asked for, and the results exposed how unreasonable his management approach was. If Richard had been open to feedback, willing to trust experienced professionals, and honest in his own expense reporting, he would have succeeded as a manager. Instead, he chose to micromanage, demand unreasonable compliance, and commit fraud while holding others to standards he didn't follow himself. The consequences Richard faced, termination, damaged reputation, and career destruction, were entirely the result of his own choices and actions. If you're dealing with a micromanaging boss who demands unreasonable compliance with rules, consider whether following those rules exactly might be the best way to demonstrate their unreasonableness. Sometimes the most effective resistance to bad management is perfect compliance that exposes the absurdity of the policies being enforced. And sometimes the most satisfying revenge is letting someone destroy themselves through their own demands while you do exactly what they asked. Update. I recently heard through professional networks that Richard attempted to get a management position at a consulting firm, but they discovered his termination for fraud during background checks. He apparently tells people that he was unfairly targeted by a vindictive employee and that his expense issues were minor accounting errors. Some people never learn that their problems are caused by their own dishonesty and incompetence rather than other people's malicious intent. Have you ever dealt with a micromanaging boss who demanded unreasonable compliance with rules? How do you handle situations where following policies exactly would create absurd results? I'd love to hear your malicious compliance stories in the comments.